Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. So what I'll be talking about today, mostly remote tower operations. And so everybody here has an idea or their perception of what remote tower operations are. And I think a core part of what we need to discuss is really what that is. Different ANSs have different thoughts on what the operation is, and we can go through that, talk a little bit about what it is, why potentially we need to do it, and how do we go about deploying a remote tower, remote monitoring application. Then we'll get into a little bit of a discussion around video and why we think video is a significant component of a remote tower operation. And finally, we'll get into some samples. So what are some of the ANSs around the world doing today with regards to remote towers, remote monitoring applications? So first thing we need to look at really is, what do people think remote tower operations are? And this is kind of one extreme. So the idea that you've got a windowless room somewhere that's packed full of equipment, packed full of people, providing control services for airports all around the world. And this may not be a reality, obviously, in the short term, but is it somewhere we can get to in a number of years? And is it really something that's applicable within what we're trying to achieve with remote towers? So to move on a little further, we talk a little bit about what really remote tower services are. And the first thing we need to identify is that, as many programs as there are today for remote towers, there's different names that people call this operation. And not only that, but we get into staffing. So you've got different ways of doing remote towers. You've got different staffing that you apply to remote towers. Do you use air traffic controllers? Do you use flight service specialists? Do you need less people for a particular operation? And really, what it comes down to at the end of the day is you're trying to provide an ATS or an ATS-like capability, but being both site and with having both site and visual independence. And so you're basically in a situation where whatever the service might be, it doesn't have to be a core air traffic control service like what you're offering today. It could be a reduced level of service. And really that ties into the staffing behind it. So, from a motivation point of view, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But one of the important questions that we ask typically, we're not that far away from remote tower operations. And so what are some of the things that we do today that are somewhat like a remote monitoring or remote tower operation? And we look at things like contingency or backup towers. So the idea that you can actually have a tower environment outside of the airport setting that doesn't have any windows, and you can operate at 70 or 80% efficiency. So is there something more that we can do to take that to the next level if you were to include some additional technological capabilities? The other thing to look at are runway blind spots. Today there's all sorts of airports all around the world that have blind spots between the tower and various runway areas, and we get around that in a particular way, whether it's procedural or using technology such as video. We get into airport operation centers. So typically you've got airport operation centers, again, windowless, full of equipment and technology that allow you to make certain decisions based on what it is that we're seeing from a system point of view. And finally, a big one here is as airports grow, we're getting into a situation where more and more runways are being built further away from air traffic control towers. So you can actually have threshold areas that are 4, 5, potentially 6 kilometers away from the tower. So really, what can the controller see with his eyeball at that, or her eyeball at that distance? And so you're in a situation there where, okay, potentially we're already there. It's not a quantum leap to get to a point where we're actually providing a remote tower service. So why? Why all of a sudden? And I've seen year over year significantly more interest in remote towers at this show this year over last year. And so why is it that there's so much interest? And obviously a big component to it is cost. So it's cost driven. Fluctuations in air traffic. So we're seeing a reduction over the last couple of years in air traffic, but we're required to maintain a certain infrastructure, and so we can't reduce our expense base proportionally to our decrease in traffic. So we need to figure out a way to do that. And the big one here is human resource shortages. So we've got many controllers that are going to be retiring over the next 10 years. And so what do we do in those situations where we need to replace the service, or we need to replace the controller because we can't maintain that level of human resources? So all of these things, and there's a host more that I'm sure you're all aware of, but these are some highlights for me. And so really it comes down to you need to provide a level of service, but you can't provide it cost effectively under any other circumstance. So what I mean by this are low traffic sites. So today you have sites with low traffic, so the alternative is no air traffic service. So today we've got nothing or an air traffic control tower. So what is it that we can do potentially in between? You've also got issues, certainly from in Canada where I'm from, geographically speaking, we've got many remote sites. And so it's very cost prohibitive to provide an air traffic control service in those sites, both from an HR point of view and from running communications equipment and technology in those areas. And finally, airport expansions and new tower construction. So today, you've got new runways that are being built. Some of the time, new runways being built require additional air traffic control tower. So that weighs in your cost-benefit analysis. Well, what if all of a sudden you didn't have to build a new air traffic control tower? What if you remove that from your cost base when you're doing your cost-benefit analysis? What does that do to your growth plans? Potentially, it allows you to speed them up, obviously. So as an industry, I think there's all sorts of reasons in all sorts of different areas where we need to continue to pursue efficiencies, especially obviously as they apply to the cost base. So how? So what do we do? I mean, everybody's talking about remote towers. What do we do to get there? So obviously for me, I think intelligent video is a catalyst to remote tower adoption. So the state of the technology is such today that it can be applied to all sorts of different applications, and we believe that remote tower applications is one of them. So the idea that you have localized surveillance capabilities, but a localized surveillance capability that can grow, that can scale to provide full surveillance capabilities. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important. But the other component here is basically the idea that you can do this based on off-the-shelf hardware. Again, cost-benefit analysis, you're trying to make sure that your cost base is at a point where it just makes sense to deploy a remote tower service. So we'll get into, again, along the lines of how. So we need to be in a situation where we can leverage our investment. So is there something that we can do with the technology today that we can use it in our current operation, but at the same time, it allows us to look at these future applications. It allows us to look at these next generation applications. Do we have to look at integration with other systems, flight data processing, radar data processing systems? And really one of the main things here is from a development of your concept of operations point of view, there needs to be an ability here. Not all ANSPs can support a full concept of operations, development of a full concept of operations. There are ANSs out there that are simply looking for a solution. And so we need to recognize that in some situations, the engineering requirement from a people point of view, operational people to support the development of ConOps, that might not be available to us with every ANS. So we need to be able to provide something that's streamlined, something that's turnkey for them. And finally, probably the most important thing is really buy-in from a stakeholder point of view. So as an air traffic controller, as soon as you hear the words remote tower service, right away you think, okay, well, you're going to cut a bunch of jobs. And so in terms of selling it internally, there are all sorts of things that we need to look at instead of replacing jobs. And obviously the big one is providing a service where we otherwise wouldn't be providing a service. So you actually might be adding jobs in those situations. So all to say from a stakeholder buy-in point of view, I think very early on there needs to be a lot of sensitivity placed on how remote towers are introduced into any organization. And certainly among our customer base, that's something that we've seen. So it is dealt with very delicately.